Hello YouTube, this is AugustusLarch. I made a video about a prediction of horrible events about a year or so ago. And I predicted that Pakistan and India would get into a shooting war and nuclear weapons would be involved, and they would discharge a nuclear weapon and get radiation or a weapon into China by accident, and China was going to take over the entire Middle East. But it went different. There was an Asian influence, but it wasn't an aggressor. It was the Fukushima meltdown. There was a nuclear disaster. I felt it with my mind. And there was a nuclear disaster in Fukushima. And their fuel ponds were the worst part of the deal. So, they had a bad earthquake in China. And their electrical lines and stuff came tumbling and crashing down. But then they had backup power at these nuclear plants. So they had backup power up and running for their pumps. But then the tsunami hit and took those out. And now they have a cratering hole. And it would have been worse. There would have been pieces of it blowing up and spreading itself all over like a big old dirty bomb if there wasn't for those Japanese people that went over there and figured out how to flood the spent fuel ponds again. But still, they still have trouble there for many years to come. I think it's still leaking radiation. But take for instance, there's a big solar events this year with the Northern Lights, and I go outside usually every year. It's common to have Northern Lights here because that's where the magnetic field cones down kind of in this area in the north. I'm like 8 miles from Manitoba here in Minnesota, and I see usually a lot of Northern Lights in the summertime too, except this year when they tell you to go outside and look at the Northern Lights. It's down in Kansas and Missouri somewhere, but not here. What is it, a magnetic field changing around? Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, that's right. Tampa Airport changed 10 degrees. They had to repaint the numbers on the runway. And they only change numbers if they go more than 10 because they drop the last digit off with runway numbers. It's a compass heading with a number missing. So instead of having it 60 degrees, it's like 06. And the runway, instead of having it 310 degrees magnetic, they just have it 31. And if it's 320, it's 32, runway 32. It's almost going straight north. And the other way, it would be like 3117. You see, they don't call it 170, they call it 17. So that's enough of that. But anyway, if we have a solar event here, and the magnetic field's all changed around now, and there's a big solar flare, like a nice big sustained solar flare when the magnetic field is down, it'll do bad stuff. Well, the last time this happened, it was in 1921. The magnetic field was the same way it is now. They had a huge stellar event, and their telegraph wires were hot to the touch. They go outside, and the telegraph operator's saying, "These wires are hot." And they were just wires that were like bare copper wire strung from insulator to insulator for hundreds of miles. And that was getting hot from the radiation that was coming from the sun because the magnetic field was diminished. If that happened today, with the amount of current that's running through the kind of grid that they got operating now, there'll be serious problems. There'll be transformers blowing up. There'll be substation components melting down. Do they have replacements for all this stuff? There'd be a blackout worldwide. Unless they've shut down the grid, totally shut it down before the stellar event. But I doubt anybody has the wherewithal to do that. Yeah, we're having a scheduled blackout nationwide because we can't have any current going through these lines because there's going to be a stellar event, and the magnetic field won't protect us this time because it's altered. See, there'll be Fukushimas everywhere because I don't imagine they've had that contingency yet. They're not going to schedule a blackout. That never happens. It always is, oh man, we thought we could handle it. It was a cascading blackout. I guess it happened. They have rolling blackouts. that happens, I guess that's a scheduled blackout. But that's pretty much a stopgap measure too. What's gonna happen? They had those telegraph lines, they had a little bit of current running through them, and they would run hundreds of miles out. They'd boost the current on the line with a steam engine. Back they had gas engines, but when telegraphs were back in the 1860s, I think they started running telegraph wires all over the place. But this was in 21, their telegraph wires were all hot. If that happened today, the amount of current going through that grid, and it got hit by even more current, there'd be transformers on fire, blowing up, blackouts. And then the nuclear reactors, if they have backups there, do they have the equipment there that the nuclear reactor can produce enough power to sustain its own maintenance, like pumping the water through the fuel, spent fuel? Because if a rod, they're still hot and radioactive, but they're a spent rod because they're not reliable to get them in and out of the core assembly. The rod, it's a fuel rod. It gets spent because it breaks down whatever kind of potassium or whatever, cobalt or something, the other components of the fuel rod, to keep the stuff from being supercritical all the time. They put them together in a fuel assembly and then pull the rods out and then become critical and heat up water. But after the fuel rods are in they're spent rods, and they're in a storage facility in a pond. Like in Japan, they had 10 years of spent rods. Some of these plants in the United States, I imagine they have 30 to 25, even 40 years of spent fuel rods in the pond right next to the reactor. And if all their electrical components get blown out in a nationwide solar flare-induced blackout, then what would happen? Then what happens? We get a bunch of these Fukushima events everywhere, all around you. There's a nuclear power plant to the south of me, and it's like 300 miles away. Monticello. I can imagine one day after the cataclysm, if the radios are still up, there'll be a radiation warning. You have to stay inside today because there's a south wind, and Monticello is still, it's such a cooking crater of radioactive filth that no one can get near it, and we're just cordoning it off. And we're watching the weather to make sure that we tell people to stay indoors, preferably in a basement behind 11 inches of concrete, until we tell you to stop, until we tell you to go outside. Bring food and water with you. If you have symptoms of radiation poisoning, this is what they are, and you can take these precautions to yourself. Whatever. What a world we live in. And then the cataclysm, children. What if it really goes cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs because of this whole thing of nobody taking care of stuff, really? So this is another prediction of horrible events. Hopefully they get that nuclear shit under control before the disaster hits. This is AugustusLarch. Thank you for watching YouTube.